Sometime before 1910, in a conversation whose outcome mattered far more than its exact wording, the most respected polar explorer alive gave Robert Falcon Scott one piece of advice for surviving Antarctica. Take dogs. Not a few. As many as the ship could carry. Scott heard him out. Then he built his plan around something else entirely: ponies, machines, and the strength of his own men's backs. 2 years later, on one of the most remote, featureless plains on Earth, that same choice would leave him pinned in a tent 11 miles from the supplies that could have saved him, writing down words he already knew were his last. This is Downfall with Mike. And this is the story of a transport plan that made perfect sense in a London meeting room, and turned out to be almost impossible to survive in Antarctica. To understand why Scott chose the plan he chose, you have to go back further than the Terra Nova expedition itself, back to the last time he'd tried to use dogs at all, and watched it go badly. On his first Antarctic expedition, the Discovery Expedition, Scott took a team of sled dogs on a sledging journey south in the closing months of 1902, and it went wrong almost from the start. The dogs had been fed a batch of dried Norwegian fish that turned out to be spoiled, and their condition collapsed because of it, sickening, then dying in the middle of the journey. Nearly every dog on that trip died, worn down by the bad food, with the weakest ones killed along the way to feed the ones still standing. Scott came home from it convinced that dogs were, at best, unreliable, and at worst, a cruelty he didn't want to repeat. Then, a few years later, he watched a rival try the opposite approach, and get a far more complicated result than the headline suggested. Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition set a new farthest south record in 1909, beating Scott's own Discovery mark by hundreds of miles, using ponies to haul supplies for most of the route. But all 4 of those ponies were lost before the record-setting push itself, 3 worn down by the crossing, 1 lost down a crevasse, and Shackleton's final dash to that record was done entirely by man-hauling, with every pony already gone. To Scott, watching from a distance, the takeaway still landed as simple. Ponies had carried Shackleton further than dogs had ever carried Scott himself. The part of the story where the ponies ran out long before the finish line mattered less to him than the part where he'd failed with dogs personally. So which lesson did Scott actually walk away with? Both, pointing in the same direction before anyone else had even weighed in. He carried them straight into the planning of his second attempt. By the time he sat down to plan the Terra Nova expedition, Scott wasn't approaching the dogs versus ponies question as an open one. He'd already lived through the version of the story where dogs failed him personally, and read from a distance a version where ponies looked like the answer, even though a closer look at that same story would have told him they weren't. That's the state of mind Scott was in when Fridtjof Nansen weighed in. Nansen wasn't a casual voice. He was the single most accomplished polar explorer of the era. His ship and his methods were exactly what Roald Amundsen would go on to build an entire winning strategy around. And Nansen's advice to Scott was blunt. Rely on dogs. Take them in numbers. Don't split your strength across half measures. Scott had reasons to say no that felt to him like principles rather than excuses. He had his own moral discomfort with the way dog teams were run. Animals worked past exhaustion, weaker dogs fed to the stronger ones to keep the survivors moving, a practice he found genuinely difficult to stomach. He was willing to eat his ponies once they'd served their purpose. He wasn't willing to run his dogs the way Amundsen was about to. There was a second pressure in the room too, and it wasn't really about animals at all. Scott's patron, Sir Clements Markham, a former president of the Royal Geographical Society who'd mentored Scott for over a decade and helped organize this very expedition, held a firm belief about how a British expedition ought to be run. That hauling your own equipment across the ice by your own effort was, in the philosophy he pushed on the men he sponsored, the true British way to explore. Dogs were what the Norwegians used. Man-hauling was what an Englishman did. So Scott built a plan around all 3 instincts at once: ponies to carry supplies partway, 2 experimental motor sledges to solve the traction problem with machinery instead of animals, dogs brought along but held back from the final push, a supporting cast, not the engine of the whole operation, and underneath all of it, man-hauling. For the stretch of the journey, Scott considered the real test of the expedition. It was a plan built from real experience, real ethics, and real national pride. It also ignored the one piece of advice that came from the person who'd actually made this exact kind of journey work. And it was about to be tested against a rival who had no such reservations at all. There was one more problem baked into the plan before the ship ever left port. This one had nothing to do with the dogs versus ponies debate. It had everything to do with how badly the ponies themselves were bought. Lawrence Oates, the officer eventually put in charge of the ponies, wasn't yet with the expedition when they were bought. The purchasing itself fell to Cecil Mears, a man with no real horse-buying experience. The ponies he brought back were, by most accounts, poor stock, unfit for the specific punishment Antarctica was about to put them through. Oates himself, once he finally saw them, didn't hold back. The greatest lot of crocs I have ever seen. The Terra Nova left Cardiff on June 15, 1910, carrying that plan, those ponies, and no idea yet that anyone else was racing them for the same prize. That changed on February 22, 1911, when Scott learned that a Norwegian expedition under Roald Amundsen had made camp at the Bay of Whales, closer to the pole than Scott's own base, and running, everyone now understood, the exact same race. Amundsen's plan leaned into almost everything Scott's plan hedged against. Dogs in large numbers, run hard, and fed on local seal meat instead of imported rations. Weaker dogs sacrificed to feed the stronger ones and the men, exactly the practice Scott had found himself unable to stomach. No motor sledges, no ideology about the right way to travel. Just the fastest tool for the job, used without sentiment, driven by a team of Norwegian skiers who'd grown up traveling on snow and understood in a way Scott's team never quite did exactly how much a well-run dog team could carry and how fast it could move. 2 expeditions, 1 prize, and 2 transport plans that couldn't have been more different, already in motion, months before either man would reach the pole. The plan's weaknesses didn't wait for the final push to show themselves. They showed up almost immediately. The first depot-laying journey, in February of 1911, began in what one contemporary account called a state of hurry bordering on panic, and the ponies struggled from the start. 3 of the weakest were sent back early. 2 died before they made it home. By the time the party approached 80 degrees south, the surviving ponies were failing badly enough that Oates, the one man on the expedition with real experience handling them, pushed to keep going, betting the ponies had that final stretch left in them. Scott overruled him. Worried the remaining ponies wouldn't survive the trip home if he pushed them any further, he chose to lay the expedition's critical supply cache, 1-ton depot, more than 30 miles short of where it was originally meant to sit, trading distance now for a chance at getting the ponies home alive. It's a small-sounding call in the moment. A supply point moved 30-some miles closer to home to protect a handful of exhausted animals. Neither Scott nor Oates could have known, standing on the ice that day, that the exact location of that depot would matter more than almost anything else in the entire expedition. Of the 8 ponies that began that depot-laying journey, only 2 made it back alive. One more, worn past the point of recovery, gave out on the march home and had to be put down before the party even reached the sea ice. 3 more were lost within a single day on that same return trip in early March of 1911, when the sea ice the party was crossing broke apart beneath them. 1 pony vanished in the initial breakup. 2 others fell into the gaps that opened in the ice and couldn't be saved. Only 1 of the 4 ponies caught in that breakup made it off the ice alive. And the whole time, killer whales circled the open water around them, close enough that Scott described them in his own diary as all about us in an intense state of excitement. The men could do nothing but watch, and the ponies weren't the only piece of the plan falling apart at the same time. When the main polar party set out that October with 2 motor sledges, ponies, and dogs, the sledges broke down completely within about 50 miles. The solve it with engineering piece of Scott's 3-part plan, gone before the real work had even started. By December, exactly as Scott had planned from the beginning, the dogs were pulled out of the push entirely. On December 11, 1911, Cecil Mears and a companion turned back toward base with the dog teams, leaving the final stretch to the ponies, soon to be shot for food, exactly as intended, and to the men themselves hauling their own sledges by hand across the polar plateau. Then, in the first days of January 1912, with the pole finally within reach, Scott made one more call that would compound everything already in motion. He'd planned for a 4-man polar party the entire way. Food, fuel, and even the tent itself had been sized around that number for months. So why break that plan at the very last moment? He decided to bring a 5th man instead. Henry "Birdie" Bowers, pulled up from the support team. The clearest reason on record is simple enough. Scott wanted a second experienced navigator on hand to independently confirm their position once they reached the pole. Rival claims to the North Pole had already been publicly disputed a few years earlier, and Scott didn't want the same argument following him home. Other accounts call it a more impulsive, last-minute decision. Either way, three men, Lieutenant Evans, Lashley, and Crean, turned around for base, and Scott, Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Edgar Evans pushed on toward the pole together. It was meant to protect the credibility of whatever they found at the pole. What it actually meant was 5 men now splitting rations, fuel, and tent space that had been packed, calculated, and cached in advance for 4, a shortage that wouldn't show its full cost for another 6 weeks. But that started compounding from that very day. On January 17, 1912, after months of hauling their own weight across some of the harshest terrain on the planet, Scott's party reached the South Pole. Amundsen had already been there. His tent was still standing, along with a letter to the King of Norway, personally entrusted to Scott by name, on the assumption that Scott's party would be the ones to find it, in case Amundsen's own men didn't make it home to deliver the news themselves. Scott's party had been beaten by 34 days. Scott's own diary entry from that day says almost everything you need to know in one line. The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. There was still an entire return journey standing between them and home, one that the original transport plan had never actually been built to support. The return leg turned into a slow collapse. Edgar Evans, weakened and injured, died on February 17, 1912, a little over 6 weeks into the ration shortage that had started the moment Bowers joined the party back at the start of January. Scott had planned for dog teams to meet the returning party partway home, to resupply them for the final stretch. It never happened. Cecil Mears had already stepped back from further dog driving duties, and Edward Atkinson, the officer who took over organizing the dogs, ended up pulled toward a different emergency instead. A critically ill officer needed rescuing, and that came first. Between the dog food Mears hadn't carried forward and the dogs being diverted to that rescue, the one piece of the original plan that could have saved the return journey, dogs held in reserve for exactly this moment, simply never reached Scott in time. Reaching the meeting point 3 days ahead of schedule and finding no one there, Scott pressed on with 3 men now failing badly. Lawrence Oates's feet had deteriorated into severe frostbite, and by mid-March, in Scott's own description, his hands as well as his feet were pretty well useless. He could still see what his condition was doing to the other 3 men's chances. On the night of March 16th or 17th, 1912, even Scott's own diary isn't certain which, Oates got up, said he was stepping outside, and walked into a blizzard rather than let his condition slow the others down. Scott recorded his last words exactly. "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He never came back, and his body was never found. 3 men were left, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. On or around March 19th, they pitched what would become their final camp, and a blizzard closed in around them and refused to lift. They were 11 miles from One Ton Depot, the same depot Scott had chosen more than a year earlier to lay over 30 miles short of its original planned position, to spare a handful of ponies that died anyway not long after. For days, the blizzard didn't lift. There was no fuel to spare for anything but the barest minimum, and no strength left in any of the 3 men to fight their way through weather that strong. Scott's last diary entry is dated March 29, 1912. It's presumed to be the day he died, alongside Wilson and Bowers, in a tent they never left. A search party found them there on November 12th of that same year, roughly 7.5 months after they'd stopped writing, less than a dozen miles from the supplies that might have kept them alive long enough to be rescued instead of found. Every downfall has one hinge point. Scott's wasn't the blizzard that trapped him 11 miles from safety, and it wasn't even the depot he laid short to protect his ponies. It was a decision made in a planning room, years earlier and thousands of miles from the ice. The choice to build his entire strategy around ponies, machines, and the strength of his own men, when the most experienced polar explorer alive had already told him exactly what actually worked. Amundsen took that same advice, ran the same race, beat Scott to the pole by over a month, and brought every one of his men home alive. Scott's plan wasn't reckless. It was principled, experienced, and, on paper, entirely defensible, right up until it wasn't. That's what makes it worth understanding, not writing off as bad luck. This is Downfall with Mike. The calls that end people are almost never reckless. They're reasonable, right up until they're not. Subscribe for more of those stories. Next time, we look at a pilot who put her own fatal mistake down in writing, 5 days before it mattered, and vanished trying to find an island 2 miles wide in the middle of the Pacific.